last couple weeks I've been doing a series on the heart of a warrior. And I started with strength, and I used, Samson as a kind of a bad example. Good example physically, but bad example spiritually. And from there went to Paul, who exhibited a lot of inner spiritual strength, which is what we're mostly concerned about. We don't care if you can bench press 500 pounds. What we care about is how strong you are within and where our strength comes from, which is God. And we see in Paul, with all that he went through physically, he remained strong spiritually to the point where he could be in a Roman prison awaiting his execution the next day, and he's still singing praise songs to God. And so then last week I talked about humility and used a king to do that. That was David. And with humility, we're talking about not looking down upon yourself. The Bible really doesn't want us to do that because we are His children. We are His craftsmanship. And so we are very important to God. And so He wants us to think very well of ourselves and have the confidence in ourselves to be able to do what He has given us to do and use the gifts that He's given to us. And so humility isn't beating ourselves down. That's Satan's job. He doesn't need any help. Humility is knowing where our strength and our success and goodness comes from, which is, again, God. And you'll see kind of a theme that arises with these attributes of the warrior. And it's all in, it's not so much me, it's more, it's what God can do in me and can do through me. But because of that, the very power that created the universe is at work in my life and in your lives. And because of that, all things are possible. But we have to give credit where credit is due. We have to see where our success and power comes from. When David went out on the battlefield, he's not relying on his own skill and the fact that he had defended sheep against lions and tigers and stuff. He went out there knowing that God had delivered him from those animals. And because he had done that before, he would also deliver him from that Philistine. And so he went out there with just as much confidence as Goliath did, that he was going to be the one walking off the field that day. But the difference is that Goliath, he came out there in pride because his confidence was in himself and his size and his strength and his armor and all of that. And David went out there with the power of God, knowing that God was going to deliver him, and therefore the giant was going to die that day. Because it wasn't him going out there. That giant was coming against his God. So now this week, and by the way, that teaching on humility, that was like the best one I think I've done in a while. So if you missed it, it was yeah. I missed doing that joke last week, so I had to fill it in this week somehow.
We're all so humble that went right over our head.
Yeah. So this week I'm doing trust. And I trust that I'm well prepared for it. I hope. What we're and you'll see a lot of the same things with trust as well, as what I've talked about with humility and with strength. They kind of overlap, but yet there's differences. It's kind of a different focus of almost the same thing. Trust, when we're talking in the Hebrew, it's chasa. And chet, samek, and hey. And that's what I was trying to look up at the beginning. I was trying to see, remind myself of what the word pictures were, see if there's anything cool there. You have a fence and a support revealed, which is kind of, the word means a refuge or a place where you flee for protection. And so the fence thing with the het, that makes a lot of sense. And then God supports us as we run to Him in our time of need. So the pictures do work. You just have to fit it in with what it means. The first thing that came to my mind when I was looking at the word was like when a child gets hurt, where do they run usually? Mom, yeah. And they do that because that's their sense of protection. That's where they know they're going to get comforted for their boo-boos and scary things and all. They just run to mom. And so God is our Heavenly Father. And when the world comes against us and the darkness of the world comes against us, where do we run? It ought to be our Heavenly Father. He is our refuge. You look through the Psalms, and David is constantly talking about how God is his refuge and his stronghold, and God is the one that he runs to when his enemies are coming to take his life. So God is the one in whom he trusts, and he's trusting his entire life in God. We can take a look at Israel, and when God brought Israel out of Egypt, the first thing he has to do is teach them how to trust in him, because they didn't really know the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob very well. They knew the gods of Egypt a lot better. So here, God appears to Moshe and is dealing primarily with him. And Moshe has this whole burning bush experience and all these things where God reveals himself to Moshe in a powerful way so that he knows who he's dealing with, and that this is the God of his forefathers and needs to be listened to. So when he says, you need to go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go, Moshe kind of resists a little bit, but he, with some help with his brother, Aaron, he does go and do it. But then when it comes to Israel, that's a little different. They have to kind of, at least at first, they have to take Moshe's word for it. Of course, then you have the 10 plagues, where God shows himself to be powerful and greater than all the gods of Egypt. But that's about all they know at that point of who this God is. when it comes to trusting God, he has to work a little harder. He has to show himself to them more. You can't really, in order to trust somebody, you have to know them. And it's coming up somewhere. You have to. Anyway, you have to know that person in order to trust them, and God is the same way. You know, there's things that you will do with somebody that you know that you wouldn't with somebody that you just met. You're not necessarily going to let give the keys to your house to someone that you just met, or your car, or let a family member be one of your kids be alone with somebody that you don't know that well. But once you get to know somebody and you feel like they're trustworthy, then you are more willing to let them do things, and you do things with them, and you tell them things, and you give them things or lend them things that you know you're going to get it back. You can give them $10 and send them to the store to go get something for you, and if there's change, you know you're going to get it back. There, and so God is the same way. Israel, he could have. We would have expected God to deliver Israel from Egypt and bring them right to the promised land. But he doesn't do that. He brings them to the wilderness. And when you really think about that, it doesn't seem to, at first anyway, it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. And it didn't make a whole lot of sense to them. They're like, what? Yeah. Of course, the first thing that they encounter, he delivers them from Egypt, and they're like, yay, we're getting out of Egypt. And then, well, what do they encounter? All of a sudden, they're between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army. They're like, wait a minute. God just brought us out here to die, right here, and so then God had to provide a way, make that path through the Red Sea so they could go to the other side, and then the Egypt army tries to follow them, and they're the ones that end up dying in the sea. Now you would think that after the 10 plagues and then that they would say, okay, well, God is powerful, he's on our side, he's got our best interest in mind, and things are going to be good. But then, right after that, what's the next thing? They look at the land, and there's no food, there's no water, and they're like, oh, we're going to die. And it's so easy for us to forget God's blessings and the ways that he's taken care of us in the past. I think that when we talk about trust, it gets closely linked to faith. Trust and faith kind of go together and are almost synonymous in Scripture and in our minds. I think there is a little bit of a difference. Faith is our shield. In Ephesians 6, we have the shield of faith. And so it's something more tangible. It's something physical. And we even, in Hebrews 11, it talks about how faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. Science likes to tell us that our faith is just up here. It's just it's just what you believe, but there's no proof of it. Well, according to Scripture, there ought to be proof, because faith is evidence and substance. So that shield is something physical, something that we can point to in the physical realm, even if it's something that you have experienced that nobody else has experienced. It's still something that you can point to and say, I was here and now I'm here, and the only reason why I moved is God. Or the only reason why there's a difference is God. Or, and it could be all kinds of things. We read in 1 Peter that we ought to be able to make an account at any time for the hope that is within us. And I think it's referring to that faith, that evidence, the substance of that something tangible that we can tell somebody that doesn't know God and say, I know that there's a God because of this, because of this thing that happened to me, this thing that I experienced. And it might be, hopefully, it's more than one thing. It should be something that happened recently, even, and because God should always be at work in our life. So then, our faith is actual, tangible things, and that block the doubts and the fiery darts of the enemy. When the enemy says, "Are you sure about this? How do you know that God is real? How do you know that He loves you? How do you know that He's all powerful?" We say, "Well, I know that because of this, and because of this, and because of this." Then your faith becomes a shield. But in order to have those tangible things that you can point to, that you have to exercise your faith, in both the Greek and Hebrew minds. An intellectual belief has no value if it's just in here. If you're going to say, I believe that chair is going to hold me up if I sit in it, it doesn't mean anything until you actually sit in the chair. You have to put that belief into action in order for it to mean anything. And it's the same thing with faith. Just to say you believe in God, okay, so what? That belief ought to come forth in action. Yeshua's talked about, let your light shine before men so that they can see your good works, not your intellectual beliefs, but your actual, tangible good works, and praise your Father in heaven because of it. It's when we put our faith in action, we exercise our faith, that's when we're trusting in God. So as we put more trust in God, then we give God the opportunity to give us those tangible things in our life that we're able to then use as a shield against the enemy. Make sense? Anything to add to that while I figure out where I'm at? Hopefully from somebody who's actually in the room.
What else do you say?
Yeah.
Kevin?
Yeah.
It's sad when you see non-believers having more tangible, seeing more evidence in them than in believers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's like, okay, they may not have faith in Yeshua, but they show it more than people that say that they do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and probably I would guess that anybody that you talk to, if they say they don't believe in God, if you tell them, well, how do you know there is no God? They'll tell you. Because this happened to me, and if there was a God, this wouldn't have happened to me, which is not logical, but in a mind of a person who doesn't know God, it's something that makes sense. It's really only until you have a relationship with God that you know that there's bad things that can happen even if you have a relationship with God, and God is able to. He doesn't necessarily keep you from certain things happening, but He's able to bring you through those times. There's things that you can learn, just like what I talked about with Israel. He didn't bring them right to the promised land when He brought them out of Egypt. He brings them to wilderness, this place where there's really nothing. There's no food. There's no water. They're just kind of in this place that is not very pleasant to be in, and all logical appearances, they're going to die out there. There's nothing for them. Why would God bring us here? We must have made a wrong turn somewhere. We must not have heard God right. He must have told us to go this way, and we went this way. Why are we here in the wilderness? But no, that's where he brought them, and he had purpose for them while they were there. So, but anyway, people who either don't believe in God or they have their own beliefs about God, typically they have reason for that. But then a lot of times you can talk to a believer. Well, how do you know that God is real? How do you know that He loves you? How do you know this? And so, well, I don't know. That's what I've believed all my life, and my, because my pastor says so, or that's what I read in the Bible, or I don't know. It's the answer isn't very, very clear. But when you can say, well, I used to be a drug addict, and I as soon as I turned my life over to God, that next day I haven't touched drugs since, or anything, something like that, or I was sick and almost dead, and people prayed for me, and I was healed, and that's the only reason why I'm here today. It's those kinds of experiences, those kinds of things that when you, especially if you have many of them, it's not just, oh yeah, I had this experience about 20 years ago, and I haven't experienced God in my life ever since, but I had that experience, and so I know, no, it's it. And if you don't have those experiences, probably you're not putting your trust in God enough to allow Him to give them to you. We like to be safe in how we live our lives, and living a life of trust in God is not safe all the time. You have to put yourself out there a lot, and allow yourself to be in situations where if God doesn't come through, you don't know what you're going to do, and you might not even make it. Just like Israel in the wilderness, if He didn't provide them with manna and water and protection from people around and stuff like that, they would have died out there. That's the situation He put them in. When they look around and say, we're going to die out here, in a way they're right. But in a way, but they also, having seen what God did in Egypt on their behalf, and the whole Red Sea, bringing them through that, something should have told them, well, He's taken care of us before, and pretty recently. We just have to trust that He's got some plan somewhere, somehow, and He's going to take care of us. And some of them did. But even Moshe was like, yeah, I have to go with them on this one. This doesn't look good out here, God, you need to help me out here.
Look at Job.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and see, Job, he had a special kind of faith. One that a lot of us could only, I think, hope to attain, where his faith was such that he was going to follow God and trust in God, even to the point of death. Because he says, I even have the scripture here, Job 13:15, even if He slays me, I will trust in Him. So that's the level of trust that we need to have. It's like going from, it's not just kind of sticking your foot out on from one rock to another and just putting enough weight that if the rock gives away, you can come back. It's like that. You talk about the leap of faith. That's what it is. You take that leap and you jump on that rock, and if the rock falls and doesn't hold you, you're dead. And so when it's talking about trust, that's what what the Bible is really talking about. Is that wholehearted, your God is all that you're hanging on to, and if He lets go, you're done. But that's what Job had.
But still, Job had to go through that trial. I mean, he had to.
Oh yeah.
He had to live it out. He was crying out, saying, "God, where are you?
Yeah.
Why don't you hear me?"
Yeah. He had his faith, but he was also starting to get his doubts. Like, wait a minute, why is God putting me through this anyway? And so things started to kind of turn in his head, I think, in some ways. Well, yeah.
Yeah, you must have sinned. There must be something.
There has to be something.
Yeah.
This doesn't happen to good people.
But it was God didn't let it go too far. When Job started kind of thinking about some of these things, even just thinking about some of these things that they were saying to him, yeah, I've been a righteous guy. Why is God doing this to me? Kind of thing. Then God comes on the scene, and it's like one of my favorite parts of you stand right there like a man, and I'm going to talk to you. Makes him feel that big. And he's like, yeah, you're right. 4 chapters later. Were you there? Yeah. Yeah. Did you make this earth?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it just makes me think of, all through the Bible, He always allowed them to go through some type of, it's like He let them go for a time to kind of just trust Him, and then there'd be a time where they would be tested, in their faith in God, and where they say, well, you have faith, and you're saying you have faith, but how do you have faith? I'm going to test your faith and see if it produces what you say it does.
Mm-hmm.
And in life, it's full of things like that, where we are put in a situation where we can't run.
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing we can do is trust God. And that really shows if our roots really go down deep. If our roots go down deep, where it says that we'll be like a tree by the water that plants in every season, no matter even if drought comes or famine or whatever, will prosper in everything we do. Because the roots went down deep underwater. And He allows that to happen to kind of show us that even in all of these little things in our life, He has His hand on every part of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of scary sometimes because we fear the unknown, but it's the unknown that drives us forward.
Mm-hmm. And when I talked about how when God brought Israel out of Egypt, He brings them to the wilderness, not where they would necessarily want to go, but He's doing it to teach them that He is God, and they need to trust in Him wholeheartedly with everything, not just how are we going to eat and survive, but they're about to go into a land that has where there's people already living there, and they're not the nicest people in the world. They're not just Israel's not just going to show up and say, okay, God gave us this land, you need to leave, and they're going to be like, okay, here you go, no problem, our bad for living here. No, that Israel's going to have to go in, and here they've been slaves for 400 years. What do they know about warfare and that kind of thing? So how are they going to go into this place where there's not just people, but these are like big people, giants, and fortified cities and huge armies, and make these people leave, and in a lot of cases completely destroy entire civilizations so that they can come in and take that land that God had given them. And so He has to toughen them up a bit. And they have to kind of go through, like what I went through when I went into the military, but a lot harder. It was like basic training for them. And He has to take this nation of slaves and turn them into warriors and people who, but not just in a physical strength, in a physical way, because it's not by might nor by strength, but by the power of God that they're going to take this land. So they have to learn to trust in God, so that when they see some giant in front of them, they don't freak out and run the other way. They go, okay, so they have a giant. We have a God who's bigger than the giant. No problem. And, oh, so they have a wall. Okay, we'll march around the city, and our God will take care of the wall. Yeah, but it takes knowing God well enough to be able to trust Him, so that when these things happen, they're like, okay, well, our God's got this, no problem. Instead of going, "Oi, what's going to happen? We should just go back to Egypt," like most of them did. Like we had 12 spies that go into the land, and 10 of them come back, and they're like, "Oh, they're giants. There's no way we can do it." There was only 2 of them that had the faith that was like, "Okay, God told us we got to take the land. We got to go, and we got to take the land." And one of them, the name was Joshua, and which Yehoshua is God will save us. It's the longer form of Yeshua. And technically probably the better, more accurate name for Yeshua. But I don't get too technical about that. I'm just going by the difference of God will save us and He saves, or salvation, which is Yeshua. But anyway, Joshua is the one, and then there was his best friend, Caleb, who has the wonderful name of Dog. I think I have that right. Makes me wonder if he was actually a person or if it was actually Joshua and his dog. No, I'm just kidding. But Joshua is given the task of leading the people into the promised land when the time comes, and it's because he's one of the few that have that kind of faith. Sometimes God gives us tasks to do that seem way above our pay grade, and usually that's the case. Because it's not our work, it's His, and so if he gave us work that we could do ourselves, we wouldn't need Him, and so then we would think it was our work, and wouldn't need God. So He gives us big jobs a lot of times. Well, how did God choose me for this? Well, what we don't realize is that at times God sees things in us that sometimes we don't even see ourselves. But he looks at us, and when he's deciding who to give certain jobs to, says that's the person that I want. And with Joshua, we can even see that he had a faith that unrivaled most, if not all, of the leaders in Israel at the time, except maybe Moses. But then Moses faltered and wasn't able to lead the people into the promised land. And so then God had to bring up Joshua to do it for him. But it gives us this picture in Joshua leading the people into the promised land. It gives us this picture of the Messiah, who pretty much has the same name, and he's leading us today into, as we follow him, he leads us into the promised land and the plan that God has for each of us as we continue to follow him. But he teaches us how to trust in God. That's really where what is most important in our relationship with God as we seek to become a stronger warrior in the kingdom, is to trust in God. The victory that is ours, he has promised us victory, but we're only going to have that victory as we trust in Him to give it to us. Now, that was the time, that time in the wilderness when God is teaching His people how to trust in Him. That's the time that He gives them the Torah. And I don't think that that's an accident, because the more you follow Torah, in order to do that the way God intends, it in itself teaches us to trust in God. And because there's even some laws that, well, why do we have to do this? Well, just because it's there, because God tells us to do it. And you just have to trust in Him that He knows what He's doing. Did the people then know some of the issues that we know today about eating pork or shellfish or whatever? Probably not. Why did He tell them to? When you're in Israel at that time, He said, well, you can eat this, but you can't eat that. It doesn't necessarily make sense why you would do one and not the other. Maybe it made more sense to them in some ways, because they could see the pagans offer these, pigs on their altars. Maybe that's why God doesn't want us to do it. I don't know. I wasn't there, so I can't say. But today we can say, oh, well, it causes these health issues and this problem. Well, I don't think they knew the medical stuff behind it. It was more, well, God told us not to do it, and we're going to trust that He knows what He's talking about, and we're just not going to do it. And then years down the road, when they happen to be healthier than the pagan nations, I wonder why. Oh, well, maybe it's because of our diet that God told us to eat, follow. And so it's things like that. Well, why does He tell us not to work one day a week? Well, maybe when we're healthy and everybody else is stressed out because they're working all the time, maybe we'll figure that out or something. We have to trust that when God says, I want you to take a break here, or I don't want you to do this, or I want you to do this way, or put tassels on your garments or whatever, and so, why don't we do that? Instead of asking why all the time, just, okay, God said it, He's God, I trust that He knows what He's talking about, and I'm just going to do it. Now, there's something to studying and knowing something of why He might have made certain commands so that we can get the lesson out of it and stuff, but what it really comes down to is obedience to God is about trusting in Him, whether it's Torah or it's being led by the Spirit or anything that we read in God's Word. He tells us to do it or not to do it. If God said it, that ought to settle it for us. And we just have to trust that He knows what He's talking about and just do it. And the more we do, the more we know God. We get to know Him. The other thing besides knowing God, in order to trust somebody, you got to know them, but there's also a lot of communication that takes place. You ever notice that in Torah you have Moshe and God conversing like all the time? Well, God told Moshe God said to Moshe, tell the people of Israel to do this, and then Moshe's going to God and saying, oh, the people are complaining again, what am I supposed to do? And they're talking all the time. And almost everything that you read is Moses talking to God and God talking to Moses, and there's constant dialogue that's going on, and the more that happens, the more Moshe and God are getting to know one another, and they're developing that relationship, and so then the more you communicate with really anybody, the more you get to know them, and you know who they are, and how they think, and sometimes you don't even have to ask them certain things. You just know what they're going to say. And those of you who are married kind of know that. And so, but that requires communication. And so that's another important part of trusting in God, is communicating with Him on a regular basis, so you know His will. So God is our ultimate commander, and when the Bible talks about trust, it's talking about God in particular, and anything else. God is the only thing that we have that is 100% trustworthy all the time, in every way. So if you're when you're talking about the kind of trust where you're just wholeheartedly taking that leap of faith, going from where you are to that rock, that if it doesn't hold you, you're falling to your death, then the only thing that you can rely on 100% is God Himself. Anything else, I think that, and maybe some of you can help me with this thought process here, but there's certain things, we can't just live our lives not trusting anybody or anything, but anything else that we do trust, it has to be with caution. Things that are given to us by God, since He's trustworthy, if God has given us something, then that has a much higher degree of trustworthiness than something that we just seek out ourselves. Primarily, first thing I want to talk about is God's Word. Now, a lot of people get technical about certain things about the Bible. I had a whole biblical criticism class in school, so I know a lot of the arguments, and people like to pick it apart, and this is, we don't know if this is historical, or we don't know if Jesus really said this, or we don't know about this, or all these little inaccuracies and stuff like that. And after a while, you just like nitpick certain things, and next thing you know, like the Bible is no different than some fairy tale, which a lot of people think that that's all it is. But the thing is the Bible has more historical and textual evidence to support it than any other book that has ever been written. And it's not even by a little bit. There's thousands of pieces and fragments and all kinds of stuff that to back up the validity of the Bible, where certain other things like the Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey and stuff like that you might have like 5 original pieces in existence that back it up, or it's that kind of thing. But you don't hear people picking apart these other texts and these other historical pieces of literature and trying to say, oh, well, this isn't valid, or this isn't true, or this. It's the Bible that gets hit all the time, and people are always trying to say, well, this isn't valid, but the evidence supporting it says otherwise. And I have to believe that if God inspired the writing of the Bible, there's a certain level of inspiration in its transmission throughout the years, so that the main message and that God has for us, the main things that we need to know to have a relationship with Him and know His will and do it is clear, no matter what Bible you're reading. Now, of course, if you're reading an English Bible, you just have to keep in mind that you're reading a translation of the original text, and there's always going to be little inaccuracies here and there if you're reading a translation of anything. Just a transmission from one language to another. So, until you actually take the time to learn Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic so you can look at an original text and read it fluently and know what it says and what it meant at the time that it was written, we just have to rely on what we have in front of us. And for the most part, like I said, the main message that you're going to get, it's gonna come through. God has protected that, and so I think David had something.
Just along the same lines, there came a point that I had to say, I just have to have the faith that God's going to teach me, and I'm going to be open to receive what He has in His Word, regardless of the translation. And then as time goes on, to further delve into it and dig into Hebrew and stuff like that, it still didn't change my faith. When I used to going service initially, Psalm 23, and I've said this before, that part where I walked through the valley of the shadow of death was really important to me. Now that I'm past 60, that green grass valleys and stuff like that, where the peace is at, it's the same song. So how our perspective will change over time. And God's teaching us along the way.
Yeah, well, the text that we have in front of us is like a foundation or more like a door kind of thing. And when we walk through that door, it's really, the Spirit takes over from there. And as long as the door and the foundation remain intact, the Spirit is able to show us what He wants us to know in that text. And it's not going to, I don't think he's going to be, oh, well, I would teach you this, but you're reading the wrong version. So I really can't. He's going to teach you what He needs to teach you, whether, when you sit down to study His Word, He will teach you what you need to know, and so you're still trusting in Him. You're not trusting so much in the text and the people who canonized the text and translated the text. You're trusting in God, right, and what He has to show you through that text. So, yeah.
I think it's interesting to point out because we're doing a study on around Proverbs 25, when it says that the word of God can conceal a matter. You pointed out that the word is bizarre, which is the word. It's a good thing that the words are concealed, because there's joy in searching out things in the word. And I would say that something like the confusion of the tongues is not
Yeah. Another thing that we can trust is the armor that's described for us in Ephesians 6. And again, that's the spiritual armor that God gives us. There's actually scriptures that talk about how people will trust in horses and chariots and their swords and the physical weapons and armor that we have in the world. When people trust in those things, they can and will fail. But when we trust in God's spiritual armor and His protection and the weaponry that He gives to us, that can be trusted. We're cautioned, in Psalm 146:3, we're cautioned about putting our trust in mortals, in people. But at the same time, like I said, you can't, when it's talking about do not put your trust in princes, for one thing, that's talking about government leaders and that sort of thing, and there's there's a difference between trusting and honoring. We're to honor those in authority, but you don't necessarily have to trust them too much. But yeah, or at all. Yeah. But God gives us, puts people in our lives that, whether it's friends, family, local body of believers, there's people that He puts us with. That as you get to know one another, there's a certain level of trust that you have to have for other people. But it might not be the kind of trust where you're completely jumping, putting your whole life in somebody's hand necessarily, unless it's needed. But that can only really be in God. But there's a certain level of you have to trust the people that you're fighting with to some degree. Yeah. I have to balance this with what I talked about last week, that our trust has to be in God and not in ourselves. At the same time, there's a difference between pride and confidence. Pride is a reliance on what I can do and how good I am at certain things, instead of trusting that God is in control and it's really Him working through me. At the same time, we have to have confidence in what God has done in our lives and has taught us, and use what He's given to us, the training in righteousness that we have had. We have to have that confidence to be able to use it and move forward as He leads us. And then we have to trust in what He has told us in His Word, that our enemy, our spiritual enemy, has already been defeated. Yes. It makes a difference in how you fight when you know that your enemy has already been defeated. You'll notice that we cannot trust without humility. As long as our trust is in ourselves, our success is only as good as that which can come from us. And I know if I'm trusting in myself, that's not going to get me very far in this world. It has to be God, though I can have confidence in knowing what God has done in my life. We cannot always predict how God is going to mold our lives and where He will direct us as we follow Him. There are a lot of surprises and situations that seem less than favorable. We wonder what God is doing and whether we are the ones who made a wrong step somewhere. If I am remembering correctly, it doesn't seem that people in the Bible accidentally end up where God doesn't want them. If God has to ask, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? You're supposed to be over there. It is when the person knew at some point where they were supposed to go, and they chose to go a different way. Take Jonah, for instance. He knew that he was supposed to go to Nineveh, but he said, no, I'm not going to go there. I'm going to go the complete opposite direction. And then there's Elijah, who was supposed to go and prophesy, but he was afraid for his life, so he runs to the mountains, and then God has to show him this vision and how he's the still small voice and things. And ultimately what God is showing him is this is what I have made you. I have made you a prophet. Now go do what I've called you to do. Don't worry about your life. Don't worry about, who wants to kill you and what might happen to you. Let me deal with that. You go do what I've told you to do, is essentially what he's telling him. But I don't see where people end up in one place because they like somehow missed something that God had. God was directing them here, and they ended up over here because they missed what God had tried to tell them at some point. So it's easy for us to think that today when God seems to be working in your life, and then all of a sudden it's like you're in this wilderness, and you're like, wait a minute, I was on my way to the promised land. I must have made a wrong turn somewhere. God doesn't seem to be at work anymore. What happened? I must have done something wrong. Well, I think that's the enemy doing that, putting those thoughts in your head. That, oh, well, you must have screwed up. God isn't with you anymore. You know, God went over here and you went over there. You missed it. Yeah.
We were told one time that sometimes in order for God to get you from point A to point C, He's got to take you to point B.
Yeah.
And all we can see is point C to get there straight from point A. And
Yeah.
when point B comes around, it makes us question God.
Yeah.
You know, God's intention all along to take you to C to B.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot that the people had to learn when they were in the wilderness that they wouldn't have learned if they hadn't gone there, and they had to learn that before they went to the promised land. God had showed them that to begin with, and so they may have expected, well, right from Egypt to go from Egypt to the promised land, because God had showed them that. But a lot of times God will show us the end of the road, and He doesn't show us that there's this whole zigzag, and that this is there's all these other little stops along the way. I think there's a list of all the different places that Israel camped before they got to the promised land, and it's something like 72 different places in the 40 years they were literally wandering in the wilderness. But they weren't really wandering aimlessly, they were following God. But He would move from one place to this, over here, to over here, to over here, to over here, to over here. And I was like, what the heck? Yeah, what is He doing? And I could imagine that at times they must have been like, they could see it right there, and like, oh, we're almost there, and then He brings us over here. It's like, wait a minute, no, we're not supposed to go over there. It's right there. Why? It's like, no, you got to go over here first, and then over here. Moses led Israel out of Egypt after having grown up in Pharaoh's household. David became king of Israel after a childhood of being the least in his family and tending sheep most of his life, up to that point. Israel had to be slaves before being the head of nations. So there's a lot of times where you have to go through that valley of the shadow of death before God leads us to the green pastures. We often have to be put in a situation or in situations where we learn where our strengths lie and have the opportunities to develop new ones before moving on to the plans God has for us. He often lets us know where we are headed, but doesn't show us a long, difficult path He is going to take us on in order to get there. However, God's promises to us are like the top of Mount Everest. You can see it in the distance as your goal, but in order to get there, you have to climb the whole dangerous mountain and acclimate yourself to the altitudes as you go. If you had a helicopter drop you off at the summit right away, you'd die within 2 minutes because your body is not ready for it. When your guide tells you to stay at a certain place for a week or until weather clears more, you have to trust that they know what they're talking about and do what they say if you want to arrive at your destination. The results for not doing so can be deadly. The plans God has for us are His plans, not ours. He not only knows the beginning and the end, but all the stops in between. Trusting in God involves making sure we are doing the journey with Him and not in so much of a hurry to get to the end that we leave our guide, our guide behind. Without Him directing our path, the results could be deadly. Proverbs 3, 5 and 6 tells us, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths.